Great. So I'm here with Amos. How you doing today?
Yeah, really good. How are you?
No, I'm great, thanks. Yeah, really good to have you on. I'm looking forward to this one. Just to start off, I'd love to hear kind of, in your own words, a 2 to 3 minute rundown on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Amos, founder and CEO of Dovetail. So we're an early stage climate tech, climate finance startup. We help investors fund the transition to net zero. So our mission is really closing the multi-trillion-dollar funding gap that capital markets need to bridge for it even to be possible to reach net zero by 2050. But had a slightly unusual route, I suppose, to entrepreneurship and venture. Did an English degree, started out my career as a journalist, then spent some time living in China, studying there, and then did a master's, and then moved into tech. So it was kind of this multi-stage route, picked up some tech skill set, got really interested in the climate tech space, and eventually made my way to founding Dovetail with a former colleague.
No, that's awesome. And it's a really interesting kind of patchwork background, but also you can see, with each step you've taken towards your end goal. I do want to dive into Dovetail, obviously, but before that, I understand kind of, you mentioned journalism. You were in financial crime, which is a very, very interesting kind of subsector. I'd love to hear, any kind of standout stories from that, anything that really sticks in your mind that was interesting or, unique.
Absolutely. I think financial crime as a topic sounds very sexy, and then it's actually a very, very detailed pursuit. It's, being a very good investigative financial crime reporter is about unpicking financial flows step by step through financial records from different companies and countries, through kind of hundreds of shell organizations, and working out who the beneficial owner of assets is and how they've kind of been enabled for money to flow through from its criminal source to the kind of sense of legitimacy it has in its final form. I was working for an outlet that specialized in a readership who were professionals in compliance and money laundering, terrorism financing prevention. So a lot of what I was doing was, what's the latest this week in loan financing to launder assets against a private jet or something, kind of doing infographics on money laundering mechanisms. But a particularly cool moment was, I was doing my own podcast and I was interviewing the person who'd set up the financial investigation into 9/11 for the FBI. And terrorism financing is usually quite difficult to unpick from a money laundering perspective. The amounts of money tend to be quite small. For many attacks, you just don't need particularly significant funds. They may be under mandatory reporting thresholds, and that makes it much harder to follow them through the global financial system. And so his explanation of how they started to do that with the 9/11 attacks was a very fascinating moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Did you ever get to kind of talk to the other side of that, to the criminals themselves, or was it all from behind this glass wall, so to speak?
What was unfortunately all from the other side of the table. Yeah. My boss was a barrister, and he'd been involved in prosecuting some of these crimes, so he had some perspective. And the other thing that was kind of slightly ironic was that I was based for a lot of this time in Jersey, in the Channel Islands, which is no longer, but certainly had historically the reputation of maybe being a bit of a center of financial crime, or at least interesting financial structuring, put it very carefully. Not to cast any aspersions on the people that I work with, who are certainly on the right side of the table, but maybe that setting was a kind of added some interesting spice to the work that we were doing.
And did you get any insight into kind of, obviously you are just on the other side of the table, but into the mindset of kind of the people that do this and the way they structure these things? And obviously it's not just, these aren't petty crimes. Typically money laundering is, very well thought out, very structured, involving, off the top of my head, I imagine tens and hundreds of different people working in unison to conduct these operations. Kind of what did you gather from, the mindset and the strategies behind the people that would do something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two halves. So there's financial crimes, which are the complete crime in and of themselves. Something like insider trading, white collar crime, corporate fraud. But very often, financial crime is kind of a follow-on to a primary crime, whether that's being, a corrupt leader of a kleptocratic state and wanting to have money to spend in luxury goods in Europe, or very obviously something like the drugs trade, illegal arms trade. So you've got that primary thing that you're doing, and then it's what do you do with the proceeds. Um, I think one thing that's particularly interesting is the way the paradigm has shifted over the last couple of decades, from it being a kind of, I guess, what you might imagine when you think of financial crime, which is like $100 bills being stored under kind of mattresses and put in suitcases and taken to banks and paid over the counter, and now where it's really about kind of complicated international financing structures. So I kind of get a loan against an asset, and I put up something else as the security for that loan, and the security for the loan is owned by a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, and you create this sort of very complicated third-party structure where no physical money actually really has to move at all. It's just about kind of playing with the ownership and securitization of assets, and then basically doing that to transfer beneficial ownership.
So you actually had like no formal finance training. So were you kind of learning all of this on the job, or was that a prerequisite to getting this?
No, not at all. Yeah, I read my boss's book the day before the interview. We walked around Hyde Park. That was the interview. Chatted about journalists that we liked. I had got really into economics reporting, I think. So I loved doing an English degree. I didn't think that I wanted to do a master's in English literature, but I guess being a good English student is kind of reading closely, listening closely, being analytical, being a good writer. And then I got really interested in stuff like Planet Money, Tim Harford, more or less on Radio 4. So like trying to get my head around the very basics of economics. And that was basically the foundation I came in with. Finance I knew really very little about at all. And I think showed my ignorance many times. And frankly, I still am all the time in different ways.
That's all about learning on the job though, right? Yeah. And then kind of, you went then to Palantir. So what was that job like? Because I want to unpack this as well, because it's really interesting. You kind of went from a typically quite commercial role, if I'm not mistaken, a researching role, into much more of a technical role, and you kind of taught yourself coding along the way. So I'm seeing a pattern here where you're kind of jumping into things and learning on the job, which I think is really entrepreneurial and obviously kind of foreshadowed what you would go on to do. I'd love to unpack just, how that process at Palantir went, when you shifted from perhaps a less technical role into a more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was also another step in between, which is that I went to Beijing with the Schwarzman Scholars Program to do my master's. Was living out there, and I guess gradually realized that I wasn't sure I wanted to stay as a journalist, which is unfortunate, because I pitched my way into the program by saying like I want to be a great foreign affairs reporter, and that's the value I'm going to get from this experience. And then 2-3 months in, I was like, no, actually not sure that is quite right. I'm actually really interested in tech. And spent a couple of months, I think, basically annoying the hell out of everyone on the program who had any link to tech at all in their career, by asking them, anyone they'd ever spoken to, any contact they had who might be able to tell me how on earth an English student with journalism experience gets a job in big tech. And one of the most formative experiences on the way through was that the careers department of this program, it was a very different perspective from the kind of English university careers approach that I'd kind of come through, where you kind of look at grad schemes and you write up a nice CV and you send off some applications and you go through interview processes. And they basically said this, like, your network's your net worth. You've got to be on the ground. You've got to speak to people. You've got to send cold emails. And it was much more of that hustle, which I hadn't come across before. And at a certain point, they said, get on a plane, go to San Francisco, go to the Bay, and speak to as many people as you can. And so I got on this flight, which, by the way, is a complete screw up, because it lands before it takes off because of the time zone difference, and turned up completely jet lagged, and spent 10 days just like speaking to anyone who would have a conversation and visiting all the big tech campuses down the Bay and stuff. Eventually got a contact in the privacy and civil liberties team. So on effectively the kind of ethics, compliance, and privacy engineering side of Palantir, which was an incredibly interesting organization and a really serious and thoughtful set of individuals. And that became my route into Palantir after I graduated. And so I went in basically doing writing still. I was writing commercial RFPs and proposal documents. So over a couple of years, I got very familiar with selling the company's products and describing them in relation to their competition and their use cases. But I had no experience of actually using and deploying them. And that really came, I guess, through lockdown and having nothing better to do.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think a really good piece of advice is something I was talking to my sister about earlier today, actually. She's doing an internship right now. She's still at uni and kind of, maybe not sure if she's enjoying the project she's been given and this and that. And I said, look, if you can't afford a flight and everything and do all the stuff you did, good advice would be, find everyone in your building or immediate area, work out what they do, work out the kind of things that you're interested in, and just pattern match and work out who would be the best people to speak to and really be proactive in that sense, and opportunities will open up for you. And then so you, during lockdown, taught yourself how to code so you could better understand the products you were selling. How did you go about that process?
I think I had a really good couple of years, but what I realized when lockdown hit is that I've been traveling a lot, doing the job I was doing. And Palantir had a relatively small team for the size of company it was, and a very kind of high travel culture, at least pre-pandemic. And when that was taken away, I realized that I wasn't sure how interested I was anymore in the job I was doing. I'd been motivated by the travel, and all that moving around had been the stimulation I needed. The job itself, even though I love the people I work with, I'd got to a place where it was starting to feel a bit familiar. And I thought a lot about leaving. And I thought about jobs that, in retrospect, seem very telling. I thought about the police. I thought about joining the army. I thought about the intelligence services, not that they'd have had me anyway, but jobs that kind of weren't desk jobs very clearly. And I think I was just feeling a bit stuck. And then I was like, it would be such a waste to be at this organization with some of the most brilliant technical minds in the country and not try and learn a bit from them. And so kind of sat down and started to teach myself the principles of data science. I certainly never got to a very high level, but I got to a point where I could comfortably join a team of data scientists and go and deploy Palantir's software to end users. So to kind of switch from sales commercial side to the deployment side. And then was able to continue learning on the job. And lots of people kind of telling me my code was terrible and refusing to ship it to main and all that stuff, which is how you learn to write better code. So,
well, now everyone has GitHub Copilot anyway, right? So that would be a problem. And then is this kind of the bridge then towards your own business, Dovetail? Was it kind of the combination of, maybe your bit of financial past combined with your growing technical coding skills that allowed you to launch your company?
I mean, a huge part of it was meeting my now co-founder, Philip, who'd done his PhD in sustainability modeling, effectively, that kind of supercomputer-driven computational physics approach. So really ground up, molecular level, how do you think about sustainable energy systems and what energy storage systems work and what don't. But he had been working in sustainability in a sense for his whole career. And at Palantir, he was working on a contract we had with BP. And we met through this organization of, I guess, climate activists within Palantir. So people who were thinking about different ways the company could be greener, company's own ESG policy. And at a certain point, we had the idea that perhaps we'd have a longer lever, a better capacity to reduce emissions if we focused on our customers, if we could convince them that we could do something valuable for them rather than Palantir itself. I guess that was probably the start, really. And that led us into experimenting with different deployments and projects and solutions with BP. And Philip had done a bunch of work before I met him there, and then building out, in the end, a kind of dedicated climate team and selling that to Palantir's existing customers and then to net new customers. So we spent, in the end, a couple of years before I left doing climate data stuff together within Palantir.
Oh, I see. So the groundwork was already there and you already had a kind of a working relationship. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Great advice for anyone looking for a co-founder as well. So let's go into Dovetail then. Can you describe your product and your business model in more detail?
Yeah, the mission we have overall is to close the funding gap for the transition. That there is just nowhere near enough capital from across the capital stack flowing towards climate solutions, many of which already exist, by the way, to make it plausible to reach net zero, or to, in other ways avoid environmental catastrophe. And there are many different estimates for that funding gap, but it's certainly in the trillions of dollars a year, unimaginably huge numbers. And we see ourselves as a company dedicated to solving that problem. And I would even frame it in the terms of the Paris Agreement, making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards net zero. I'm badly paraphrasing, excuse me, but that comes in the Paris Agreement just after the very famous bit about striving to limit emissions well below 2 degrees C. So, I mean, how do you do that, and how do you do that as a startup where you don't have the license to go in and build regulated financial products, for example? Well, we would data people. That's what we knew. And we felt that the obvious starting point was, what's the information gap? What's the intelligence gap? What could investors know that they don't know currently that could help them understand the climate risk and the climate opportunity in their portfolio and change the way that they invest accordingly? But the vision for us is that expands over time into not just a data and intelligence play, but also a kind of whole financial infrastructure play, working across financial markets to help them bridge the gap to funding the transition.
Okay, yeah. So is your kind of secret sauce, you would say, is the algorithms? Because I understand you kind of build out these models that predicts how companies will behave under certain climate scenarios. Is that the kind of the gist of your product?
Yeah, we're showing how companies would be affected by the transition to net zero. Since we don't know what the transition to net zero will look like, we use scenario analysis. So we take a set of relatively widely established scenarios about different possible transitions. And then within each of those, we say, what does that mean for every company that has issues publicly traded securities, and also private companies if our customers provide us the data for them? The analogy I sometimes give is, if you asked me, should I buy this house? And I said, well, the UK economy is growing at such and such a rate. The population is expected to be this by 2050, and the housing stock will have decreased by 3%. It's like, that is sort of an answer, but it's not a very useful answer. What we're trying to do is bridge the gap between that macroeconomic information and here's how the value of the house is likely to change or could change by 2050, and here's how you should think about buying it.
That is a really good analogy, and it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I was just looking at your LinkedIn post recently as well, and you put the one thing we know for sure about these climate scenarios is that they're all wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Which is, I think a lot of people would agree with you on that. And kind of maybe your first thought is, these are all heavily assumption based. Crazy kind of small tweaks will have crazy outcomes on any one of these models. So how do you kind of accommodate for that, and how do you analyze these models in terms of what are the most likelihood and try and minimize the effects of these assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, well, I want to make it clear, I'm saying absolutely nothing original here whatsoever. And that's anyone who's ever been involved in model development, from the outset that a model is wrong, and it doesn't mean that you can't do anything with it. And you take the limitations of that model into account, ideally from the start, and you bear it in mind as you work with the outputs, because we are exceptionally bad at predicting the future. And sometimes building very complicated models is just a way of obfuscating how bad we are at predicting the future. And so, thoughtful model development, thoughtful forward-looking financial analysis, it's really about, I think, unpicking relationships between things. So relationships between, say, macroeconomic trends and the performance of different industries, variations between different outcomes, potential hedges against different outcomes. Those are the things you can start to understand. How do elements within a system relate to each other, and how do they respond to external pressures? What you don't know, you can't really know, is how those external pressures will actually play out.
No, absolutely, yeah. And in terms of kind of, it's well understood that climate is going to be solved primarily through hardware, right? New technologies, things like, electrolysis, for example, more efficient electrolyzers, hydrogen's coming into play, more efficient renewables and all of that. Kind of how do you accommodate for that? And from what I gather is that you're helping to fund these different projects. Is that, do you see it in the same way I see it in terms of like these hardware products need to get scaled up and they need to be assessed based on merit, and it's just simply a matter of getting funding in, or are there other issues at play that need to be addressed?
This is an interesting starting point for me when I started to look beyond the work we were doing at Palantir and think about how my career could kind of continue in the broader climate tech space. And I looked at it and I thought, I guess it's all hardware. And what do I know about building a better battery? And then the software solutions I was seeing out there on the market, they seemed important, but they didn't seem that exciting, and they didn't seem that technologically complex either. So, carbon accounting is an obvious example. It's very hard to build a great carbon accounting business, and it's very hard to build a great carbon accounting platform. But fundamentally, the calculations you're doing, they're not that hard, and so you don't have a great deal of modeling complexity or kind of tech moat. I felt like I wanted to do something that was a bit more data science intensive than that. And financial modeling really stood out, I guess, because it does feel to me to be one of those areas in which there's that key interplay between the hardware solutions that we need to transition and basically the intelligence tools, the tools that are used to change our thinking and our understanding of the world, to get us, in this case, to sort of fund the deployment of those technologies. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
no, it doesn't. I agree. Yeah. I agree with you as well. I mean, like you look at a lot of these, particularly carbon accounting software platform. It's just like another SaaS application, right, with kind of a green skin. It's how I always see these things. It's like, how can you tangibly say that you're affecting climate change, and you can make very fluffy claims, and it ties into greenwashing, which we'll talk about in a second as well. But I feel exactly the same way. And then in terms of like kind of ESG as a whole, I have some friends who work in ESG, and I think when we're all together and they start talking about ESG, some people just roll their eyes because they associate ESG with greenwashing, with kind of corporations dressing up their books to look good, and have the likes of BP supposedly investing in wind farms and this and that, while just kind of conveniently shifting focus away from all of their oil and gas activities. Is that how you see ESG? Can you maybe like convince the listeners that it is actually a positive thing when used correctly, or is it a complete distraction from actually solving climate change?
I think ESG is a vast category. It contains many things along that greenwashing spectrum, from a great deal of genuine investment and innovation and really serious goodwill, all the way to a pretty kind of cynical ploy to manage reputational exposure and continue to secure inward investment. I guess the advantage that we have specifically in the climate, in the E, and then within that in the climate risk space, is it's getting easier to quantify behavior and to quantify impact. It's not impossible. It's really hard to have kind of robust ways to quantify social and governance factors, especially to put dollar values on them. But with the developments that we've seen in climate weather modeling and then climate economics modeling, and all the kind of research that's gone into plotting out different ways in which climate technology and policy could play out, it's become much more reasonable to put dollar values on risk and behavior, and having really serious analytical benchmarks for companies' actions. So I guess the answer is a bit of both. There are great bits of ESG and there are rubbish bits of ESG.
And it's about sifting through and finding the best bits, right? And you just touched on kind of policy there. What kind of role do you think policy has? Because I was speaking to someone, last week about this topic, and they kind of said like, obviously companies want to make profits. And the second some external body comes in and says you have to be this and that, according to this ESG checklist, essentially, they obviously start to tend to greenwashing, because a lot of these activities would actually limit their output because obviously they're deeply entrenched in, oil and gas activities and fossil fuels and all of this. So what kind of role can policy play to actually kind of find that balance between just forcing the hand of corporates and therefore, some would argue actually encouraging greenwashing, as opposed to implementing maybe more sustainable practices for these big companies such that they can kind of wean off fossil fuels?
Yeah, what role does policy have to play? I'm not, not a great political theorist at all. I suspect that where I land on this is very boring, right in the middle. I don't think that climate change is a fundamentally capitalist problem that we need to solve through degrowth. I don't think that we can just stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. But I also don't think that markets in and of themselves are so efficient and effective that without the intervention of policy, we're going to achieve any kind of transition to a sustainable future or a set of economies that can exist within the physical boundaries of the planet. Quite influenced by Mark Carney's writing and thinking in the space, I guess. He's appeared on every one of our pitch decks from our first kind of pre-seed pitch onwards, about the tragedy of the horizon and that sort of thing. I'm also, I have to say, feeling at the moment very disappointed in the current UK government's approach to climate. I think there's a real just lack of interest, deep, obvious lack of interest, and this kind of continuation of parading slogans about the UK being a climate leader, which are just not true. Maybe they never were, but they're certainly not true anymore. I was furious about this stupid Cumbrian coal mine. I saw Zach Goldsmith speak at the Climate Investment Summit last week, just before he wrote his letter of resignation around climate to Sunak, although he was probably also about to be fired, but a bit complicated. So yeah, I'm feeling a bit down on UK policy right now, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's just a wider problem with UK investment as well. Like our capital markets are so weak, and you see all these headlines in terms of X million going into deep tech funding, right? And then the same week you may see that number times 100 or 1,000 going into the US funding, and then we wonder why, particularly in the deep tech space, if we kind of step away purely from climate, the UK is so far behind, and the companies just want to jump ship and go to the States as quickly as possible. I mean, they throw money at anything to a certain degree and give you the best possible chance of succeeding. Is that something you think about in terms of your startup, or is it the market is big enough and you get enough capital that you can see a path to profitability and scale?
I think about it for myself. I spent 6 months before I founded the company living in the States. I talked about my experience, I guess, on the very culturally American master's program that I did, and that totally different approach to careers and entrepreneurship that opened my eyes a bit. I would say, though, as a startup founder, you have basically a great arbitrage opportunity, which is that you can raise capital from the US and pay salaries in the UK, and the money goes a hell of a lot further because engineers in the States are 2, 3, 4 times as expensive. So, and the cost of living here isn't great in London, but it's not as bad as it is in New York. So,
yes. Were you just on the West Coast, or did you move around in the States a bit?
I was in New York.
Okay.
And then spent quite a lot of time in Colorado with a family friend because, I don't know, if you could ski every weekend, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I've never spent any significant time in the US, but you hear exactly what you said in terms of the mentality towards almost everything. It's like it's almost like if you tell someone you're going to start a business in the UK, it's immediately kind of like, oh, it's going to fail. 90% of businesses fail, and this and that. It's negativity, right? You go to the US, and from what I gathered, if you go to the right places, obviously Silicon Valley, East and West Coast, you'll meet like-minded people who happily jump on board with your idea. And I just see it as this kind of flywheel, right? If you have the opportunities and the money to become successful, your chances of becoming successful are astronomically higher, right, than if you had all these limitations. And the same argument can, of course, be made for people with lack of educational opportunities, and that's a whole nother argument in of itself. Before we move on as well, I just want to touch quickly something that I spoke about on a podcast a couple of months ago when I was talking to the guys who run the Oxford Accelerator in climate, and they were talking about providing solutions to the global south. Now, I think obviously when we talk about climate and ESG and all of these new technologies coming to market, we often do so with such a kind of Western lens, and we think really about Europe and the US. And how do you see kind of the more developing countries, or even continents like Africa, for example, who are still going to be very, not only reliant on fossil fuels, but large parts of the continent don't even have access to electricity or energy. How do you see this kind of process playing out? Because one scenario is that we kind of race ahead and leave them all behind. There are some people who think like, oh, we kind of need to act like white knights and like bring solutions to the countries that need the most. And then another argument may be we need to encourage entrepreneurship there, such that people on the ground who understand the culture and the funding environment can actually set up these technologies. Where do you kind of stand in this whole argument?
I have two comments that come to mind. One is we've spoken to and are in contact with well over 100 independent VC funds that invest in early stage climate companies. I'm pretty sure only one or two have any presence in South Asia. Maybe one that I can recall has significant presence in Africa, where the need for solutions is most significant, where the impact of the physical damage of climate change will be felt the most keenly, but also where there's the greatest possibility for technological leapfrogging, particularly with things like energy infrastructure deployment. So there's a clear gap there, although I understand why as a VC fund with remit that you have to invest on behalf of your LPs, you might stick to European and American B2B SaaS, but it's a little easier. As the other observation, just from the way that we approach our modeling, is we've been thinking about what it would mean to model a just transition, and are quite interested in that narrative and reflecting the fact that it's the most developed countries in the world that have contributed by far the most historically to climate change, kind of people who have caused it over time, and that really must be reflected in the way that policy and investment solutions roll out. And that kind of goes into the details of kind of economic modeling, but it's about how you model out relationships between different regions and the disparity of different costs, or kind of where is there going to be the highest kind of punitive carbon policy implemented in the world, and where less, to balance out to a net zero outcome.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And then kind of, you just touched on it briefly. I'd love to like kind of unpack it a bit more in terms of, VCs, family offices, institutional investors. Are they kind of, is your sense that they're being forced to look at climate as an investment opportunity? Are they kind of, doing it at their own accord? Because you made an excellent point that obviously if you want the best returns, arguably you wouldn't look straight at climate. I mean, kind of given the whole 2022 funding scenario and the kind of reset of tech assets, you might make the argument that it probably is. And also the commoditization assassin and all this stuff. Do you kind of see that they are making the push themselves, or is it, an education problem, or, what are you kind of hearing from investors?
No, I think the I think the motivation is real and genuine, both from the desire of funds, the investors within them, and the LPs of those funds really caring about the issue set. People who allocate their capital towards VC, they're really often interested in big thinking, big solutions, solving intractable problems, and climate is a really obvious one to focus on. And I think it's pretty genuine, and I think we should feel positively. There's a kind of tendency from maybe more established investors or other parts of the capital stack to comment on how many new climate funds have suddenly popped up and ask how many of them will be AI funds in 2 years' time. But actually, I think we should be really excited about it because it's a huge amount of capital to go into backing early stage entrepreneurs, some of whom will hopefully have a real impact. I think the other side to this is that it kind of feels like the economic story is pretty obvious in a sense that actually transitioning one way or another is an existential imperative. Like it's almost certainly the case that we will not have a smooth, effective transition that minimizes environmental damage at this point. Nonetheless, one way or another, we do have to transition because it's an existential question. It is happening. It's been happening for a long time, and it will continue to happen. It's not going anywhere. So, from a kind of macro perspective, it's a pretty good bet, right? It's much harder to translate that big picture into actually backing the companies that will make a difference and produce returns at the same time. But you can see where you might, from a very top-down view of the world, decide that climate was a good place to play.
Makes a lot of sense as well. And I think on a longer time scale, I've seen people make the argument for space as well, as in space flight and eventual colonization and trying to get the species out. I don't know where you stand on that. I think whenever I mention space to people, it's either kind of like what, like sci-fi, kind of hard to wrap their head around, or it's like we're going to Mars in 30 years. Strap on, like Elon's got it. Is that something you give thought to at all, or where'd you stand on that?
I guess I'd say I probably lack the vision for that one. I'm not saying I can't believe that it's possible, but it doesn't stir anything in me for sure. I'm sticking to the planet I can see out the window for now.
It's really interesting. It's like the space it almost requires like a whole different part of your brain, or a whole different brain even, to really comprehend and wrap your head around. Just watching yesterday, because I work with a couple of kind of like people in the space industry, and you're just kind of watching like how astronauts built the ISS about 20 years ago. And it's, people up like completely spacewalking, just tethered by a bit of cable out in space, building this huge structure over the course of months and years. And it completely boggles the mind. And it's very hard to imagine yourself doing that, which I think creates this real feeling of detachment compared to pretty much any other technology, right? And then if we talk about, obviously futuristic technologies and stuff, nuclear and nuclear fusion is one that always comes to mind. I'd love to hear your stance on just, the general energy transition and where you see nuclear fitting in, because obviously a lot of people kind of fall on either side of the argument, right? They're kind of really pro-nuclear, or they're like nuclear is a sin and like it's renewables all the way kind of thing. I'd love to hear if you're as black and white, or if you have some nuance to your position.
My thoughts on nuclear.
Generally, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking on the space side. Who knows how deep these things run in us, but I was definitely never the kind of little boy staring at the stars. I don't really like looking at the stars very much, just find it a bit big and dark and scary, and so maybe I just find space a bit scary. It's too big. On the nuclear question, I have very limited expertise. I want to be clear. My gut feeling, insofar as that's important, is I've always been quite pro-nuclear. I have no kind of concerns around the morality of the technology. I think there are examples of it being deployed effectively. On the other hand, tremendously expensive, even for base load. I know a couple of entrepreneurs doing really interesting things in the SMR space that seem quite promising. I guess I'd like to see investment capital continue to flow for it towards it, but I don't know much.
No, of course, I'm with you on that. I think with all the shutting down, particularly in Germany, obviously gets a lot of publicity in terms of shutting down of the plants. That I think that was probably a long-term bad move. You've got to look at the likes of France for everyone knows that, right? But then it's easy to get excited about these new technologies coming through. The thing about SMRs is like they're not even at the moment that small or modular. They kind of are, a whole nother a whole nother nuclear power station that is supposedly buried underground. And this now we'll see how the technology develops. It is exciting. Obviously,
one of the guys on my master's program was a nuclear engineer in the US Navy, and he was basically going on stealth submarines. They go underwater for like a year at a time, and his job was to manage the nuclear power plant on those submarines. I thought it sounded awful. Like, I can't imagine a job I would least like to do, but also very cool. I guess that's pretty small and modular. It's like, we know that it's possible. It doesn't mean that you can industrialize it and scale it.
Yeah, and obviously taken to the extreme, we get that kind of horrible piece of news from the other week. When I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but I think I don't know. I think it's just arrogance and entrepreneurship and the vision taken to the absolute extremes. And is an example of when you think too big, sometimes the fall can be really hard. It's a really interesting case, that one. But I'm completely with you in terms of the claustrophobia and kind of just unusual feeling you'd get from just being in a submarine for that period of time. I think that's worse than space, frankly. I think if you're going to go up, go and into the stars and do something that only a fraction of humanity has ever done, is a noble cause. But to actually go down into the depths of the ocean, that's a whole different proposition. I find that a lot scarier personally.
I wonder if we end up in a conversation that borders on pop psychology. Would you rather look deep inside your own planet, or stare out other ones?
It's an interesting question, right? I think, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think on the submarine topic, I think before we kind of spend too much time lauding, American culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, it is worth pointing out that the pressures of that and the behaviors that encourages can lead to some really deleterious outcomes. And, obvious example, Theranos, but there are many others, young entrepreneurs who find themselves in environments, and I think I understand it much better than I did a year ago, environments where, one, there is this immense pressure not to let people down, and the more people you sign up as investors and employees and customers, the greater that ratcheting effect becomes, and the harder it becomes to step away. The kind of promise of huge rewards that seems so close that you could almost reach out and touch it. If you just kind of make it through the next year, 2 years, 3 years to the exit, it's there waiting for you. And then people kind of telling you that it's okay to lie. People telling you that you're not going to get rewarded for qualifying all your statements and telling only the truth as it stands today and not painting a vision for people of the future. And what the sensible application of that, I guess, is to talk about where things are now and what they could be. So you have this sense of growth, but you're honest about today. And that's obviously the right way to behave. But it's very easy to confuse the two and state tomorrow's world as today's.
This is a really good argument, conversation, because I was kind of having this with a mate of mine last other week. And it's like, kind of, did they intentionally set out, the likes of, Theranos and FBF and all of this? Did they set out to do this? Or is it kind of a white, maybe a small lie, something that unraveled over time and just kind of almost delusion kicks in? And you're absolutely right. I can't imagine it, but all these investors throwing kind of tens of $1 billion that you can, really probably elevate your self-esteem. You can't start seeing yourself in a different light. And there becomes the cycle of almost delusion. So I could understand a world where it starts off as something very innocent and you're just trying to sell your product and this and that, and it very quickly spirals out of control, particularly if you're so inclined mentally to, behave like that. I think some people in their mind would, kind of guardrails would go up and they'd immediately shut it off, and, something like guilt or shame would sink in eventually. But I know personally certain types of people that will, happily lie into oblivion. So I can see worlds where if you're an entrepreneur and you keep getting money thrown at you, you're just going to continue this lie as long as you can.
And at a certain point, you have no choice. You have to keep going in the hope that it will work. And I suspect most entrepreneurs have gone through several periods where they're not quite telling the truth and it works out at the last moment, so that suddenly they are telling the truth again because the product comes together or the investment comes in or the customer signs or whatever. Everyone knows the way a startup demo works is that, you've stitched together a couple of actions in a kind of clickable image, and you make it look like it's kind of amazing piece of technology because you're only 3-4 weeks away from launching the code base that can actually do that. That exists on bigger and bigger scales until you've got no choice but to keep going.
And yeah, that leads us kind of like to what advice would you give to founders? Maybe someone who's at a similar level that you are, kind of early stage, or someone looking to start a company that's maybe in the situation you were a few years ago, working in the corporation, building up skills, maybe is becoming a little bit disillusioned or a bit restless as you were, kind of looking for the next thing and wanting to move around and challenge yourself. What kind of advice would you give to them?
Um, so one of the things that I was finding quite weird for a while um, was getting used to um, people listening to what I said. Because I'm the kind of person who, I'll like throw something out, then I'll contradict myself, and then I'll like wait and see how someone reacts, and then like bounce the idea off them. And that's just kind of the way I talk things through. And once the team knows you a bit, that kind of maybe that can work. But if you've got someone new, it's their first week in the job, and you're their boss and you're telling them to do something, and they might not question you. And you have to be kind of careful, because that can just result in people wasting time and building stupid things that don't make any sense because I had a stupid idea and they ran with it. And I think I've been trying to counter that with our team by building a bit of a culture of what people are accountable for. You own the quality of this code base, you own the quality of the economic modeling. And if I'm asking you to do something to a deadline that's impossible, that's going to force us to cut corners, or I'm making a suggestion that doesn't make sense, really, really, really want you to tell me, and let's have that kind of positive conflict. Because otherwise it's all going to collapse at a certain point.
Yeah, so it's not leadership in the kind of maybe old school sense of like do as I say. It's much more of a conversation and a flat structure. I think it's excellent advice. Yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of people take getting adjusted to, particularly if you've been in quite a corporate environment for the last 5-10 years. That can take a lot of snapping out of. I would say, yeah, excellent advice as well. Kind of obviously from our conversation, you're clearly like very well read, intellectual. You like to think about topics quite deeply. I'd love to hear kind of any reading or book recommendations you have. Perhaps if you could, like one on climate policy, climate change, anything around that, and then maybe one that's purely kind of self-interest and is a great read.
Investing in the Era of Climate Change, Bruce Usher, if you just wanted a starter on thinking about what it means to fund the transition in different ways. Excellent. I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm cycling into work, so that was a great audiobook for me. I have also been listening to / reading Amos Oz, the Israeli writer, shares my name. Just taking me into just a very different world, the kind of early days of the state of Israel, and Tale of Love and Darkness. He's kind of unpicking different bits of his family and their history in pre-Nazi Europe and their progression to Israel. Bits of history that have some link to my own family, but that also are fascinating in and of themselves. And it's a slow burn, or at least it was for me to get started, but an extraordinary piece of writing.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. And then, we touched on psychology as well. Do you have any kind of recommended, books, podcasts, audiobooks on psychology, or are you kind of, I don't know, because the reason why I bring it up is because I'm an amateur psychologist as well. I like thinking about these things, but I never really listen to others talk about it. I prefer to kind of sit with my own thoughts, maybe converse with a friend and bounce ideas off and kind of reflect on my own life experiences and build up kind of structures and frameworks around that. Are you kind of one of those people, or do you actively listen to like loads of kind of philosophy and psychology podcasts?
No, nothing kind of regular and significant on the philosophy and psychology side, unless you could count more or less the economics, like the stats podcast. And I'm going to make the claim that you can, because it's about how we react. For me, that podcast is about how we react to numbers and how people use numbers to make arguments, and why most of those numbers are wrong or at least unhelpful. An episode I loved recently was why it's not true that 50% of marriages end in divorce. And even if it were true, it wouldn't make any difference to whether or not you should get married. Just kind of great unpicking of a set of numbers in a way that when you heard it was so obvious. Yeah, I really enjoy that.
Fantastic. I'll have a listen to that. Yeah. But it's been a fantastic conversation, Amos. Before we finish, do you have any kind of call to actions or shout outs you want to do?
I think a lot about the different levers that individuals have in relation to climate change. And you want to kind of avoid this situation where you feel there's nothing you can do and there's a kind of depressing sense of inevitability about disastrous climate outcomes. I'd argue that one of the levers almost all of us have in different, one way or another, to a greater or lesser extent, is pensions, other financial assets, and what we do with them. Grand scheme of things, small amounts of money potentially, but it doesn't matter compared to whether you recycle or not. The potential for impact there could be really big. So thinking about the basics of sustainable investing, what options you have with something like a pension could be really worthwhile.
Awesome. Yeah, something really different. Yeah, most people are like, here's our website, sign up, here's my Twitter, this and that. But that's really refreshing to hear. But thanks so much, man. It's been a pleasure talking, and all the best.
Yeah, likewise, my pleasure.
Take care of yourself. Bye bye.